Hello. Today on Iran Matters, we have Matthew Bunn. He's a professor of practice here at the Harvard Kennedy School and the co-principal investigator of the project on managing the atom. Welcome, Matt. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So in terms of the Iran P5+1 negotiations, we've had a first round of negotiations in Vienna. We have a framework for continued talks, from that first round. We don't yet have a sense of, how far apart the two sides are in terms of the substantive issues. What's your take on how far apart they are and, what the chances are of bridging that gap?
Well, I think so far neither side really has grasped how much it has to compromise in order for there to be a comprehensive agreement. The United States and its Western allies think that they can get a huge contraction of the uranium enrichment program in Iran and get rid of the plutonium production capability at potential at Arak, and have far-reaching inspections, and in return for a temporary and partial waiver of sanctions. The Iranians think that they can maintain virtually the entire enrichment program. Rouhani said we're not going to dismantle one centrifuge, and keep going to some degree at Arak, and accept maybe the additional protocol, but no more inspections than that, and get a full and permanent lifting of sanctions. And so there's going to have to be some major compromises from those positions if there's going to be any hope for a comprehensive agreement.
On the P5+1 side, is there is the distance there in terms of a belief that a potentially mistaken belief in terms of what they actually can achieve, or is this really based in politics in terms of posturing about what should be achieved? And I guess within that, if there is a real belief that something can be achieved, is there a political path towards to getting there in domestically for the P5+1?
Well, I think that both sides are being forced to play a multi-level game here, because you need something that can satisfy enough of the political factions within Iran to be sustainable. So they have a domestic negotiation before the international negotiation. Similarly, in the United States, you need something that will satisfy enough of the political factions within the United States to be politically sustainable. And so the United States has a domestic negotiation in addition to the international negotiation. But then the United States also has this unwieldy group of colleagues in the P5+1, not all of whom have the same interests and priorities. So it's a very, very tricky and complex. And then, of course, there are key players who are outside of the P5+1 process entirely. There's Israel, there's the Gulf states, and so on. So it's really a very tricky process that has to be managed on multiple levels. I think that Obama will not be able to defend an agreement unless you can plausibly say that it keeps Iran far enough from nuclear weapons that we would have high confidence if we're moving in that direction, that we'd see it, and that we'd see it while we still had a long period of time to do something about it. Now, exactly how long and so on is, I think, part of the negotiation. But that's what Obama needs, sort of bottom line, to be able to sell this at home. I think Rouhani needs to be able to show that at some level, Iran's rights have been respected and that they aren't walking back too far on what they have already achieved. But if he can show that they can move forward with nuclear energy, that they can maintain an enrichment program, and that they get strong benefits out of the agreement, I think there's some chance. So I still think, although the positions are very far apart to start, I still have hopes that there is a zone that would allow Obama to satisfy his domestic audience and Rouhani to satisfy his domestic audience, and that we'd be able to bring the rest of the P5+1 along. However, finding that zone isn't going to be easy, partly because of the huge mistrust from decades of conflict between Iran and the United States. There's a lot of misperception on both sides, where everything one side does is interpreted in the most negative possible way by the other side. And that's not just true of Iran misinterpreting what we do, but I think we, to some extent, misinterpret what Iran does as well.
Another thing that has come up in the negotiations and in commentary in the negotiations is a difference in interest between the P5+1 and the IAEA in terms of possible military dimensions of Iran's nuclear program. The IAEA has this ongoing investigation of the history of the program, and there has been concern voiced in the past couple of weeks about the IAEA stepping back from that investigation in order to let the P5+1 negotiations continue. Do you think that is happening? And if so, do you think it should happen? Is a good idea?
Well, I don't think the IAEA is stepping back from their investigation. I think that they, like the P5+1, understand that they need to maintain reasonable relations with the Iranian government if they're going to make progress on their investigation. But I do think there's a difference of view in that the IAEA's job is to verify. Their job is not to negotiate a comprehensive deal or anything like that. And so their interest is primarily in getting as much information as they possibly can that will help them understand the whole picture of what happened, which then will help them understand whether any of that is going forward in the future. I would like to see that too, but I think that the reality is it's going to be quite difficult for the Iranians to, after all these years of saying the whole program was peaceful, 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 to turn around and admit that there were weaponization activities in the past. I think there's going to have to be some creativity there in convincing the Iranians to provide some information while allowing them to have stories about what that information means that may not be exactly correct. One thing the Iranians could argue is, well, for completely legitimate defensive purposes, we had to understand nuclear weapons in order to defend ourselves against them, or something of that kind. And that's why we were doing this study at that lab and that study at that lab. If they will provide that kind of data, I think it's okay if they tell whatever story they tell. But I also think that if we can get strong restraints on these kinds of activities going forward in the future, I think there should be some degree of willingness to compromise, if necessary, on the quality of the information that we have in the past. If we don't have full cooperation on what happened in the past, it will make it more difficult for the IAEA to really have confidence that they understand the whole picture going forward into the future. But still, I think the difficulty of it is great enough, and the number of other things to spend diplomatic chits on in this negotiation is great enough that I think there are likely going to be some needs to compromise.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll have you back on Iran Matters.
All right. Thank you.